The check slipped from my Uncle Richard's trembling fingers and landed on the mahogany table with a soft, almost obscene sound. $500,000. The figure, written in elegant, aggressive script, seemed to stare back at me, judging me. That was my price. The value my family had placed on my life, on my future. We were in a private dining room at a preposterously expensive restaurant, a place where the silence cost more than the food. Across from us, the man who had just bought me, Mr. Davies, watched the scene with terrifying impassivity. He wasn't smiling. His eyes, a stormy gray, moved slowly from my uncle, to the check, and finally to me. I felt his gaze like a physical weight, stripping me of everything I was, until I was reduced to a mere transaction. "A pleasure doing business with you," my uncle said, his voice slick with greed and expensive champagne. He reached out to pick up the check, but Davies' gloved hand landed on it, stopping him. "The deal isn't closed yet, Richard," Davies said, and his voice, deep and resonant, caused even the waiters to stop at a respectful distance. "The most important part of the agreement is still missing." My Aunt Isabel smiled, her face stretched by Botox into a mask of false amiability. "Of course, Mr. Davies, our Lily is ready. She understands her obligations. She will do whatever is necessary to demonstrate our gratitude." I felt bile rise in my throat. Obligations? They were talking about me as if I were a racehorse or a piece of property they had just deeded. My cousin, Sophia, sitting beside me, let out a cruel little laugh. She leaned over and whispered in my ear, her breath smelling of white wine and poison, "Enjoy your golden cage, little cousin. $500,000 is a generous price for a wallflower like you. At least you're finally good for something." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. I lifted my chin and looked directly at Mr. Davies. If I was going to be sold, at least I would look my buyer in the eye. It was then that his expression changed. For a split second, I saw something in his gray eyes, something that wasn't coldness or business. It was a spark of compassion, or was it something darker, more calculated? "I'm not interested in gratitude, Isabel," Davies continued, his gaze fixed on me. "I'm interested in loyalty, and loyalty is demonstrated. Lily." He said my name for the first time, and it sounded strange, almost powerful, in his mouth. "Do you understand the terms of our agreement?" I swallowed, my throat feeling like sandpaper. "I understand that my family has accepted your offer to save the company," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "Incorrect," he corrected me, and the edge in his voice cut through the air. "Your family has accepted my offer to save themselves. The company is just the excuse." He leaned back in his chair, the expensive fabric of his suit making no sound. "The agreement is this. I save the family business, and in exchange, you become my wife. But there is a condition that your family conveniently forgot to mention in the details." Richard and Isabel exchanged a nervous glance. "What condition?" my uncle asked, his confidence beginning to waver. Davies slid a solid gold pen across the table. "For this check to clear, and for the company transfer to be completed, Lily must sign a document. A document that names her, and her alone, as the sole legal owner of the company under my guidance." "You," he said, looking at my uncle and aunt with barely disguised contempt, "are to give up all rights, all control, all power. You will become mere spectators." The silence that followed was deafening. My uncle's face went from red to a deathly white. "What? That's absurd. The company is mine. Lily knows nothing about business." "Exactly," Davies replied with a lethal calm. "That's why she needs me to guide her. And I need her. Her name, her lineage. It's the only part of this rotten business that still has any value." He turned to me, his gray eyes locked on mine, ignoring my family's protests. "The choice is yours, Lily. Sign, and you'll have a future. Don't sign, and your family will face bankruptcy and ruin tomorrow." I was paralyzed. He wasn't buying me to give everything to my family. He was cutting them out of the equation. He was giving me a power I didn't understand and a responsibility that terrified me, in exchange for my freedom. It was an impossible offer, a trap within a cage. My family looked at me with panic and hatred. They had sold me, but now, in a cruel twist of fate, Their salvation depended on me agreeing to be sold on a stranger's terms. He wasn't just a buyer, he was a player, and he had just changed all the rules of the game. And for the first time that night, I realized that my sale wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of his. Ruin has a particular smell. In the old Valentino & Co. fashion house, the business my grandparents had built from scratch in Brooklyn, it smelled of dust, desperation, and forgotten fabrics. 3 weeks before my sale, the workshop, which was once the vibrant heart of the brand, was almost silent. There were only 3 seamstresses left, older women whose loyal hands knew the secrets of every stitch, and me. I did everything. I designed, cut patterns, swept the floor, and answered calls from the creditors that rang nonstop. My uncle Richard, who called himself the CEO, rarely set foot in the workshop. He stayed in his luxurious upstairs office, probably surfing the internet for new sports cars or planning another business trip to Miami. That day, the final catastrophe arrived in an envelope with the bank's letterhead. Foreclosure. We had 30 days to pay off the entire loan or the building, the soul of my family, would be auctioned off. I ran upstairs with the letter in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found my Uncle Richard and Aunt Isabel arguing heatedly with their daughter, Sophia. The argument wasn't about the company. It was about which designer Sophia would choose for her debutante dress. Uncle, I interrupted, breathless, waving the letter. The bank. They're going to take everything from us. Richard snatched the letter from my hand. He read it, his face paling for a moment, but he quickly composed himself with his usual arrogance. Don't be so dramatic, Lily. It's just fear tactics. It's not a tactic. It's a court order. I yelled, frustration making me lose my composure. We've lost the company. All because of your luxuries, your stupid decisions, your... Watch how you speak to me, girl, he snapped, his face darkening. Don't forget you live under my roof. You eat from my plate. Everything you have is thanks to me. What do I have? I replied, my voice trembling with contained rage. An attic room and your daughter's leftovers. My parents left you a thriving company, and you've turned it into ashes. That's when Sophia intervened. She got up from her chair, her perfect face contorted into a sneer of contempt. Oh, poor little orphan. You think you have a right to an opinion? My parents took you in off the streets. You should be on your knees thanking them, not barking like a stray dog. She moved closer to me, invading my personal space. The truth is, you've never belonged here. You're a Valentino in name only. You don't have the class, or the ambition. You're simple. Isabel nodded, satisfied. Sophia's right. You've always lacked drive, Lily. But don't worry, your uncle has a plan. He always does. Richard smiled, a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. Exactly. In fact, I have a meeting this afternoon with a very important investor, a man interested in acquiring the brand. He'll save us. I felt a chill. Acquiring? You mean selling? Selling our grandparents' legacy? It's called business, Lily. Something you wouldn't understand, he said condescendingly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have to plan a party, not a funeral. They kicked me out of the office, slamming the door in my face. I stood in the hallway, the echo of their laughter ringing in my ears. The foreclosure, the ruin of everything I loved, was just an inconvenience to them, a problem they planned to solve by selling the last vestige of my inheritance. I went back to the silent workshop, the smell of dust and desperation stronger than ever. I looked at the old mannequins, my mother's sketches still hanging on the wall, the name Valentino & Co. embroidered on a satin tag, and I silently swore that I wouldn't let them destroy it. I would fight for it, even if I had to do it alone. I had no idea that my uncle's plan didn't just involve selling the company. It involved selling me too. And the investor he was about to meet wasn't interested in saving the business. He was interested in burning it all to the ground. A week after the bank's threat, my uncle announced that the mysterious investor, Mr. Davies, was coming to dinner. The house, which was usually in a state of elegant neglect, was transformed. They hired a catering service, filled the vases with fresh flowers, and my Aunt Isabel barked orders at the maid all day long. I was ordered to act as a waitress. Wear your best black dress, Lily, Isabel said, and make sure you keep your mouth shut. We don't want your simplicity to scare off the money. Sophia, of course, got a new dress and the instruction to be charming. She was the high-class bait. I was the invisible servant. The tension in the house was palpable when the doorbell rang. Richard opened the door and a man walked in, bringing with him a gust of cold air and a presence that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. He wasn't old, as I had imagined. He was about 35, tall, with dark hair slicked back and a tailored suit that screamed silent power. But it was his eyes that paralyzed me. Gray, like a winter sky before a storm. They showed no emotion, just a cold, penetrating intelligence. He moved with the contained grace of a panther, and when he shook my uncle's hand, it was Richard who seemed like the subordinate. During dinner, I listened from the kitchen as I served the courses. Richard talked non-stop, bragging about the rich history of the Valentino brand, conveniently omitting that he had driven it to the brink of extinction. Isabel laughed shrilly at Davy's humorless comments, while Sophia tried to flirt with him, leaning forward to make her cleavage more visible. It was a pathetic spectacle. Davies, for his part, barely spoke. He answered in monosyllables, watching my family like a scientist observes insects under a microscope. His gaze was evaluating, almost contemptuous. It was when I was serving dessert that something strange happened. As I leaned over to place a plate of tiramisu in front of Mr. Davies, his gaze met mine for the first time. I stopped dead, expecting an order or a look of disdain. Instead, his expression softened for a millisecond. A fleeting emotion crossed his face, something that almost looked like recognition. It was so fast I thought I had imagined it. Later that night, after the guest left, my family was in a state of euphoria. "He's hooked," Richard exclaimed, pouring himself a large glass of whiskey. "We're going to be saved." Isabel and Sophia celebrated, already planning how they would spend the money. I, exhausted and demoralized, went up to my attic room. That's when I noticed something was out of place. On my modest dresser, where I kept my personal belongings, a small picture frame that always stood upright was now lying face down. I picked it up. It was my favorite photo, a picture of me as a little girl, laughing in my dad's arms, the true founder of Valentino & Co. It wasn't a photo my uncle would display in the house. It was hidden in my room. My blood ran cold. Someone had been in my room. Someone had looked at my things. I went to the window and looked out at the dark street. Mr. Davies' black car was still parked at the end of the block, its lights off, a menacing silhouette in the darkness. He was watching the house. No, a terrifying instinct corrected me. He was watching me. The investor wasn't just interested in the company. The man who had just had dinner with my family, the man whose gaze had unsettled me so much, knew who I was. And his interest wasn't new. It was old. Suddenly, the business meeting no longer felt like a negotiation. It felt like the final inspection of a property he had already decided to buy. And that property was me. The days following the dinner were a whirlwind of feverish activity. Lawyers and accountants came and went from the house. My uncle Richard was in his element, strutting around as if he were the mastermind of a great deal, and not a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. I was completely excluded from the negotiations. My existence was erased, except when they needed me to bring coffee or make copies. They treated me like a ghost in my own home, in my own family's company. But I watched. I listened. And the feeling that something was terribly wrong never left me. The day the final deal was announced, I was summoned to my uncle's office. It was the first time I had been allowed in during the entire process. Richard, Isabel, and Sophia were sitting behind the large mahogany desk, their faces glowing with barely contained triumph. In front of them, in the visitor's chair, was me. It felt like a court. "Lily," my uncle began, adopting a falsely solemn tone he used when he wanted to manipulate someone. "As you know, the company has been going through a difficult time. But I have managed to secure our future. Mr. Davies has agreed to invest. He will save Valentino & Co. Save it or buy it." I asked, my voice calm. Richard's smile wavered. "It's a strategic merger. He will become the majority partner, but I will remain as president. It's an excellent deal. I'm happy for you, Uncle," I said, getting up to leave. "I guess my job here is done. Sit down," Isabel ordered, her voice a whip. "This also concerns you." I sat down again, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. "Mr. Davies' generosity is immense, Richard continued, avoiding my gaze. But he has a condition. A very particular condition. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. He is a very private man. He values tradition, family. He believes a business is stronger when its leaders are bound by personal ties. And what does that mean? I asked, although a part of me already knew the answer. I had known it since the night I saw his car parked in the darkness. It was Sophia who said it, with a mix of envy and contempt in her voice. It means he wants a Valentino wife. And he's chosen you. The world tilted on its axis. I looked at my uncle, expecting him to say it was a bad joke. But his face was serious. It's the only way, Lily. It's non-negotiable. He marries you, or the deal is off and we lose everything tomorrow. Marry? My voice was a broken whisper. Marry a man I don't know? A man I've only seen once? You are crazy. It's not a request. It's an order. My uncle exploded, his false amiability evaporating. It's your duty. After all we've done for you, it's the least you can do. You've cost us a fortune to maintain you all these years. It's time for you to pay your debt. And it's not all bad, Isabel added, trying to sweeten the poison. You'll be the wife of an incredibly rich man. You'll have everything you've ever wanted. I never wanted this, I said, standing up, my body trembling with fury. I never wanted to be sold like cattle to pay for your mistakes. I turned and ran out of the office, out of the house. I needed air, I needed to think. I ran to the old park near my house, the place I went when I needed to escape. I sat on a bench, my head in my hands. My world was crumbling. How could they do this to me? Their own family? Then, I heard the sound of a car stopping. I looked up. It was Mr. Davies' black car. The back window rolled down, and there he was, watching me with the same quiet intensity. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence was a message in itself. There was no escape. He had planned everything. He wasn't negotiating with my uncle. He had been hunting me. The following days were a fog of resignation. My family acted as if my submission was their own victory. They ignored me, but their relief was palpable in the air of the house. There were no more shouts about debts, only excited whispers about the future. I heard my Aunt Isabel on the phone with her friends, bragging about the brilliant union that would unite the Valentinos with a new and powerful dynasty. My cousin Sophia, on the other hand, treated me with a new kind of cruelty, a mix of jealousy for the wealth I would get and contempt for the way I was getting it. I hope you're at least good in bed, little cousin, she said one morning at breakfast. It's the only thing a man like that will want you for. I didn't respond. I had built a wall of silence around myself, an inner fortress where their words couldn't reach me. The signing of the marriage contract was arranged a week later, not in a lawyer's office, but in the same expensive restaurant where they would present me with the final price of my sale. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. It was colder, more formal. Mr. Davies was there, flanked by a team of lawyers who looked like sharks in expensive suits. My family and I sat across from them, feeling small and insignificant despite the opulence of the setting. A sharp-faced lawyer slid a stack of documents across the table. This is the standard prenuptial agreement, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. It stipulates that, in the event of divorce, Miss Valentino will not be entitled to any part of Mr. Davies' personal fortune, but will receive a generous lifetime pension. My uncle Richard nodded enthusiastically. Excellent, excellent. Very fair. He didn't care about my future, only the signature that would save his present. I picked up the pen, my hand feeling strange, as if it belonged to someone else. I was about to sign when the lead lawyer raised a hand. There is one more document. He slid a second, much thinner folder across the table. This is a confidentiality and sale agreement. Sale? I asked, the word feeling sour in my mouth. A formality, the lawyer replied without looking at me. It stipulates that, in consideration of a separate financial transaction, the Valentino family cedes guardianship and responsibilities over Miss Lily to Mr. Davies. In essence, it is a transfer of sponsorship. It was the most elegant language I had ever heard to describe the sale of a human being. My uncle became nervous. And the separate financial transaction. That's when Mr. Davies spoke for the first time. $500,000, he said, his voice a deep murmur that silenced the room. A one-time payment to the head of the Valentino family, Mr. Richard, as a token of my appreciation for your cooperation. He took out a checkbook and, with precise, deliberate movements, wrote the figure and signed. The check was placed in the center of the table, a rectangular piece of paper that represented my entire life. Richard, Isabel, and Sophia looked at it as if it were the Holy Grail. Their eyes gleamed with a greed so pure it was almost childlike. "Sign, Lily," my uncle urged me, his voice trembling with emotion. "Sign and all of this will be ours." I looked at the check. Then I looked at the contract. And finally, I looked at Mr. Davies. He held my gaze, and again I saw that strange emotion flicker in his eyes. It wasn't lust. It wasn't possessiveness. It was something that looked dangerously like pity, as if he was apologizing for the role he was forcing me to play. It was confusing, unsettling. Why would a man who was buying me feel pity for me? What kind of game was this? With my heart in a knot, I picked up the pen. I signed my name on the dotted line. The sound of the pen tip scratching the paper was the sound of my freedom dying. My uncle snatched the check almost before I had lifted my hand. In that moment, I stopped being his problem. I had become another man's property. As my family celebrated in silence, counting the money with their eyes, Mr. Davies leaned slightly toward me. "Don't worry, Lily," he whispered, his voice so low that only I could hear it. "The price they've paid is much higher than they think." The engagement period was an elaborate sham. It lasted exactly 2 weeks. My family used that time to flaunt their new wealth. Richard bought a sports car he couldn't afford and joined an exclusive country club. Isabel and Sophia went on shopping sprees, returning with bags from luxury brands that they paraded around the house. They treated me with a cold distance, as if my presence were an embarrassing reminder of the deal they had made. I was the skeleton in their new, shiny closet. Mr. Davies insisted that the wedding be a quick, private affair. But there was one thing he wouldn't compromise on: the wedding dress. "A Valentino must get married in a Valentino," was the cryptic message he sent through his lawyer. It meant my wedding dress had to be created in our own workshop. It had to be the last piece of haute couture produced under the old regime. At first, my uncle refused. "Spend money on a dress when the workshop is about to close. That's ridiculous." But a single phone call from Davies' lawyer made him change his mind. Suddenly, the creation of my wedding dress became the most important project in the company. For me, it was a strange and bittersweet reprieve. Going back to the workshop, the only place where I felt like myself, was like coming home. The 3 older seamstresses, who had worked with my grandmother and mother, welcomed me with silent hugs and eyes full of sadness. They knew the truth, or at least they sensed the essence of it. They didn't ask questions. They just got to work. I decided to design the dress myself. It would be my last act of creation, my last silent statement before being silenced forever. I immersed myself in the archives in my grandmother's old sketchbooks. I wanted to create something that honored the true legacy of Valentino & Co., not the parody my uncle had turned it into. I found an old, elegant, timeless design and adapted it. For days, the workshop came back to life. The sound of scissors cutting silk, the hum of the sewing machines, our occasional laughter. It was an echo of happier times. The night before the final fitting, as I was working alone on the last details, I discovered something that chilled me. I was sewing the inner lining of the bodice when my fingers found a small anomaly in the fabric, a bump that shouldn't be there. Carefully, I unstitched a part of the seam. Inside, hidden between the layers of silk, was a small folded piece of fabric. I took it out. It was a prototype tag, one of the ones my dad used in his experimental designs. But it wasn't blank. On it, embroidered with almost invisible thread, was a logo I didn't recognize, 2 interlocking capital HS, forming a kind of emblem. It wasn't the Valentino logo. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. How did it get there? The only explanation was that it had been sewn into the original roll of silk, a roll that had been stored in the warehouse for over 20 years, since the time my dad still ran the company. It was a message from the past, a ghost in the fabric. What did those 2 HS mean? The next day, during the final fitting, Mr. Davies made an unexpected appearance at the workshop. My family wasn't there. It was the first time we were alone. He walked in silently, his imposing presence filling the small space. He watched me as I stood on the pedestal, wearing the dress. The seamstresses discreetly withdrew. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice a murmur. He walked around me, examining the dress. "It honors tradition." "It's my grandmother's design," I replied, my voice barely audible. He nodded. "I know." He stopped in front of me, his gaze intense. Then, he did something that surprised me. He reached out and gently touched the sleeve of my dress, right at the cuff. His fingers paused for a moment, and then he looked at his own hand. On his little finger, he wore a gold signet ring. A ring I hadn't noticed before. And engraved on it was the same emblem I had found in the dress. 2 interlocking capital HS. My heart stopped. It wasn't a coincidence. The symbol my dad had hidden in his fabric 20 years ago. The symbol my future husband wore engraved in gold. They were connected. The man who was buying me wasn't a stranger. Somehow, he had been a part of my family's history from the very beginning. The revelation of the ring left me in a state of silent shock. Mr. Davies said nothing more. He simply looked at me, a long, deep gaze that seemed to hold decades of secrets, and then he left as quietly as he had arrived. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my mind racing at a dizzying speed, trying to connect the dots. 2HS. Harrison. Hughes. Henderson. His father's last name. Who was his father, and what was his connection to mine? The only person who might have answers was dead, and the man who held them was an impenetrable enigma. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. The house was silent, my family probably dreaming of their new fortune. Unable to stay still, I got up and went to the only place that still felt like a sanctuary, my father's old study, which my uncle had turned into a dusty storage room. No one had been in there for years. The room was cold and smelled of old paper and faded memories. I turned on the small desk lamp. The walls were lined with shelves full of filing boxes. I started searching, not really knowing what I was looking for. A name? A letter? Anything that could explain the 2H emblem. I spent hours going through old ledgers, supplier contracts, discarded sketches. Nothing. I was about to give up, exhaustion and despair beginning to take over, when my hand brushed against a different-looking ledger on the bottom shelf. It was older, bound in cracked leather, from an era before the company was called Valentino & Co. I opened it. On the first page, in an elegant script, was the original name of the company, Valentino and Harrison Haute Couture Designs. My breath caught in my chest. Harrison. The second H. It wasn't Davies' last name. It was the last name of a partner. My father's original partner. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding. I found records of investments, business plans, all signed by 2 men, Frank Valentino and Andrew Harrison. Who was Andrew Harrison? And why had I never heard of him? If he was the founding partner, why did the company only bear the Valentino name? I kept searching, and at the end of the book, I found what I was looking for. It was a series of letters tucked between the last pages. Letters from my father to Andrew Harrison. The first ones were full of enthusiasm and shared dreams. They talked about conquering the fashion world together. But the tone of the letters gradually changed. My dad became more paranoid, accusing Harrison of stealing designs, of negotiating behind his back. The last letter was a bitter accusation, a formal dissolution of the partnership, where my father accused Harrison of fraud and expelled him from the company they had built together. But something didn't fit. The date of the last letter. It was only a few months before my parents died in that tragic car accident. I had always been told it was an accident, a rainy night, a driver who fell asleep at the wheel. But now, with these letters in my hand, a terrible and cold doubt began to grow inside me. At the bottom of the box where I found the book, there was a small, yellowed envelope. Inside, there was no letter, but a key. A small brass key, one of those that opens a desk drawer or a jewelry box. I had no idea what it belonged to, but an instinct told me it was important. That this key opened the last door to the truth. I put it in my pocket, the cold metal against my skin. I returned to my room just as the first ray of sun on my wedding day came through the window. Now I had more questions than answers, and a much deeper fear. The man I was going to marry was not just an investor. He was the son of my father's betrayed partner, and his interest in me and my family wasn't for business. It was a revenge that had been brewing for 20 years. The wedding was no longer just the sale of my future. It was the scene of a trial. And I was about to marry my own family's prosecutor, judge, and executioner. My wedding day was a surreal blur. I moved through the preparations like an automaton, my mind elsewhere. The ceremony was a quick, soulless affair at City Hall. There was no church, no flowers, no guests, except for my family and Davy's lawyer. I signed the marriage certificate. My new signature, Lily Valentino Harrison, felt strange and heavy. My uncle and aunt were smiling, relieved that the deal was finally sealed. They had no idea of the true name that was now joined to ours. To them, Davies was just the name of an eccentric millionaire. The real celebration, or rather, the execution, would take place at a private dinner that night, in the same restaurant where it all began. It was poetic, in a cruel way. As I was getting dressed, my fingers found the small brass key in my pocket. I looked at it, wondering what secret it held. I decided to take it with me, hidden in a small inner pocket of my dress. At the restaurant, the atmosphere was tense. My family tried to be festive, but their joy was forced, hollow. Mr. Davies, or Mason, as I now knew his first name was more silent and imposing than ever. I sat next to him, feeling the static electricity between us. We were accomplices in a plan that I only half understood. He knew I knew something, and I knew he knew that I knew. But neither of us spoke. The dinner went on with a tortuous slowness. Finally, after dessert, my Uncle Richard stood up, a glass of champagne in his hand. His face was flushed with wine and arrogance. It was his moment of glory. "I'd like to propose a toast," he began, his voice echoing in the private room. "To my new son-in-law, Mr. Davies. A man of vision, who knew how to recognize the enduring value of the Valentino brand. Some would say the company was in trouble, but I call it a restructuring." He paused for everyone to laugh at his poor joke. "Thanks to his generosity, the Valentino legacy will not only survive, but will flourish. And thanks to my niece, Lily, for doing her duty and making this wonderful union possible." Every word was a lie wrapped in condescension. I looked at Mason. He gave me an almost imperceptible signal, a slight nod of his head. It was time. "Thank you, Uncle," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly clear and strong. I stood up. All eyes turned to me. "May I add a few words to your toast?" Richard looked surprised, but he smiled indulgently. "Of course, dear. The stage is yours. You talk about the Valentino legacy," I began, looking directly at my uncle. "But I think you've forgotten an important part of that legacy. You've forgotten a partner. A founding partner." Richard's smile froze. "What are you talking about, Lily?" "I'm talking about Andrew Harrison," I said, and saying the name out loud was like lighting a fuse. I saw a flash of pure panic in my uncle's eyes. Isabel gasped. "I don't know who you're talking about," Richard said, too quickly. "Oh, I think you do," I replied, my voice hardening. "And I think Mr. Davies knows him very well too." I turned to my husband. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but your real name isn't Davies, is it?" "It's Mason. Mason Harrison." The silence that fell over the table was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Mason's mask of impassivity finally slipped, and in its place appeared a smile. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who has finally cornered his prey. "My father always said that the truth, like good design, always comes to light, Richard," Mason said, his voice was silk and steel. "And tonight, we're going to unearth 20 years of your lies, one by one." My Uncle Richard's face had become a wax mask, pale and sweaty under the restaurant lights. "Harrison? That's ridiculous. It's a coincidence." "You're crazy, Lily," he stammered, looking around for support. But my Aunt Isabel was too busy looking at Mason with a horror that contorted her face, and Sophia just stared at us with her mouth open.